Today's session is titled Metaphors of E-Textiles, and we'll be joined by Boulder-based artist, weaver, computer scientist, and professor, Laura Devendorf, who is also a participating artist in the show. And we will also be joined by Munich-based scholar Annapurna Mamidipudi, who is currently in India. Both speakers have unique histories working with weavers and engineers, programmers, and today's session will be very much about how their work with these demographics has led to unique cross-pollination of ideas and also the poetry that may emerge. This discussion will be moderated by yours truly. I am Bruce, the Assistant Curator for Learning Programs at CHAT. So what we just experienced was something that we came up with together as a panel, and it was very lovely to have some video that Laura provided, and then also some audio that Annapurna shared with us. Maybe Annapurna, you could share a few words about what we just listened to and what just happened in that clip.
Yes, that's the audio from two singers called Umakant and Ramakat Gundecha, who sing in the style of Drupad, a Hindustani musical style called Drupad. But what they were singing was a very iconic song by Kabir, who's a 17th century poet who was a weaver himself, who used a lot of the technical terms of weaving to talk about life. So for example, as Laura was weaving, the song was describing how the threads move and how the shuttle moves, and so it was really overlaying very beautifully with your weaving, Laura. So you have the actual translation here on the screen, but basically what Kabir is saying is that he's talking about the body as a cloth, and that cloth is something that is given to be nurtured and to be kept well. And he says there are people who don't treat it well, who soil it, and by that he means who don't live a good life. But he says this Kabir, this humble Kabir, will take good care of this cloth. So at one level it is a metaphor, but at another level, because he is a weaver, he's actually talking about knowledge in the way he knows how, which is to talk about weaving. Laura.
Yeah, thank you. So the video that we heard, it's so beautiful. Thank you again. The video that was overlaid over the top of is, I've been capturing a lot of real-time video of my weaving process via head-mounted GoPro. So sort of using cameras in ways to understand the experience, maybe slightly differently than we would were it not recorded. It's just been an experiment in documentation, but what I appreciate about it is how it preserves the real time and the kind of very minute labor that goes into making a textile, and in this case, a textile that has embedded circuitry. So all those white threads on the left there are silicone coated wires that I'm manually routing through the fabric. And so just to think about care in the body, that this process isn't just about making an artifact, but it's about sort of forming your body in relationship to it. And so all the little ways that my fingers remember how to turn tape or how to move something under something else, I find, I don't know, I like these kind of slow videos as a way to preface that or highlight it. I'll turn it back to you, Bruce. Thank you.
So I think we really, at least I really wanted to include that as the sort of preface to our presentations today, really because I think both for Annapurna and Laura, your practices are really exploring weaving as this sort of experiential, unstable, metaphorical, technical, and tacit. I think tacit is an important word with weaving. It's also performed and embodied. And I think that these themes would come up again in these upcoming presentations from Laura and Annapurna. So I just hope for participants to really be more alert on those themes with this video. So I would like to actually now turn the time back to Laura to give us a presentation of your practice.
Okay, does everything look all right to you, Bruce?
Yes, it's perfect.
Great. All right, well, thank you so much for joining this panel today, and thank you so much to Bruce and Annapurna for having very enjoyable meetings about making this panel, and I've really loved getting to know both of you and really excited to be part of this event, which is really amazing. So my title today, we're kind of going on the theme of metaphors of e-textiles. To give you a bit of my perspective, I'm an assistant professor at the Atlas Institute and Department of Information Science at the University of Colorado Boulder. But my personal practice is really one that kind of involves, let's see, I was trained in art and computer science. So making, coding, designing and writing are all kind of mixed up in there. So this is, when I don't have such a lovely video to start with, I usually start with this video by my student, S. Wu, who did a project on taking apart woven circuits as a means of understanding different ways that we could think about sustainability in design. But I love the video because it's very slow, and you can really see, again, that way your fingers become trained in relationship to the textile. So with that, and a lot of the work that we're going to see today is work that takes place in a lab that I direct at the University of Colorado Boulder called the Unstable Design Lab. And so all of these people here have been involved in the work in various ways, and I want to say thanks to them as well. So I describe my practice, my art and my research practice, as a critical technical practice. And this is a term that was developed by Philip Agri, who was a researcher in artificial intelligence. But the kind of one-line tweet version is that I use design as a means to critique design, to see what other kinds of designs are possible. And that kind of follows a recipe or a bit of a template, which is that you look at a set of existing designs and you identify what the dominant metaphor is, what metaphor is telling us how we should relate to these technologies or these designs. Then you pick an unlikely metaphor or something different, and you redesign the technology out of it and see what else could be possible. So the metaphor that I've been most excited to critique is this metaphor of user-friendliness. And we see this evidenced in a lot of our technologies that really emphasize emotions with a positive valence, that we should feel happy and we should achieve things and we should like each other and we should love each other. And this is all very wonderful. But what it also kind of represents is something feminist scholars of science and technology studies have been pointing to, is that it's a kind of way to escape from your vulnerability or escape from like the humanness of your flesh. So as Judy Wackman writes, promises of emancipation from the frailties and failings of mortal flesh have reached a new crescendo in the cyberspace age. And so they were writing this in 2004. You can imagine that crescendo hasn't gotten any quieter. We're still kind of running from ourselves. And this is also reflected in a lot of philosophical traditions. For instance, someone like Heidegger, who has the concept of the standing reserve, that it places us outside of our environment and it frames the world around us as resources to kind of build up our skin and protect ourselves. So what I've been interested in doing, and through my practice have kind of come to this alternative metaphor of necessary frustration. So this is the idea that we're going to encounter frustration, and it's not necessarily bad. That frustration is what tells us that we're cooperating with a force beyond ourselves, and that frustration might have to be a necessary skill if we're going to live more cooperatively among other kind of humans and species. And so I like thinking of this frustration not as the thing to design away, but the thing to really foreground in design, and how we engage that frustration, and when we feel it as frustration versus when we feel it as pride or working through something. So this is really where weaving as an embodied practice has cultivated my thinking about frustration. I am not a very experienced weaver. I started weaving only about 5 or 6 years ago. And I find it incredibly frustrating. I don't know about other folks. I love it. I love the frustration. It's like a puzzle, but I love how it keeps you humble, right? It's sort of, it's not going to do anything for you that you have to kind of learn to sort of manipulate and make things work yourself. And I really like that side of cooperation. So my recent line of research and art practice has really been thinking about how we could reimagine our technologies through textiles. What would it look to sort of re-envision all the kind of infrastructure and networks we have through the idea of craft and textiles and community and materiality. So I want to start this by just talking about how we reimagine some of the fundamental technologies. So this is what's called a circuit schematic. It's a kind of a roadmap or a diagram for how electricity should move between components to achieve a certain effect. So in this case, you want to push something and have the voltage change in proportion to how much you pushed. And what I've been doing over the past few years is really thinking about how to embed these kind of schematics in cloth. And one way to do it would be to buy these, force sensors you can buy on a shelf and put them in a fabric. But instead, I've been really thinking about the structure, and that fabric isn't flat, that it has structure and it has mechanics, and that you can use these structures and mechanics to not just make a circuit, but to reinvent what a circuit actually is. And so in this case, this is a fabric that will actually be in the show. It's being installed now, and it has 6 different regions that sense pressure. And all the colored lines over the top are where the electricity is being routed through different materials. So instead of buying, let's say, a component called a resistor off the shelf, I just use a yarn with a high resistance, and I piece it in and I knot it together. So what's interesting is you're doing the exact same technological work of making circuits and circuit boards, but you're doing it through processes of mending and processes of overlaying and really slowly building it up within the structure of a fabric. And one of the things I think is particularly interesting is that you're doing this all without any adhesives. And so everything is held together with knots or by just kind of overlaying 2 materials together or routing one material through another. And that allows us to think about what would an economy of electronics look like that was fundamentally disassemblable? How could we reharvest these things? How would our relationship to technologies change if it broke and we took a needle and thread and mended it? Or if we wanted it to do something different and we could patch it up and almost literally patch it, which is a software term they use, to kind of bring out something new and different. So how can it kind of evolve with us? So this video here, it looks like it's paused a little bit. Oops, I'll go back, see if I can get that going. This is the other kind of video I had been capturing of the weaving process, where I have a stationary camera and I do a time lapse. And this, I would say, is much more in the language of user friendliness. It's like, oh, pop, 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 here's your circuit. But that first video we saw, I think really speaks to the time and the much more embodied experience of it. So this is actually the process of weaving the circuit. And I weave these on a loom that's a digital jacquard loom called a TC2. And even though the TC2 is a computer-controlled loom, meaning that it kind of reads from a file and lifts the heddles accordingly, you're still manually throwing the materials into the cloth by hand. And part of the project of the research I've been doing, which we've received support for from the United States National Science Foundation, has been to reimagine the software that you actually use to design these woven structures. And so this is an open source tool we've developed called AutoCAD. And this is actually the draft that I created that I give to the loom, that it sort of, walks through and I throw the materials. This is the draft that I ultimately used to create the piece. And you see these little annotations here on the right side of the draft are sort of cues I use to tell myself when to throw different materials or when to integrate different materials. And then I have a second feature in there that actually allows me to sort of render the structure and the color. So all the structures in this piece are 2-pick structures, meaning that there's kind of a top and bottom on each layer. And that compression is actually what gives you the force sensing, that the 2 layers compress. So it's really quite beautiful that you don't need, massive amounts of adhesives and stabilizers and whatnot. It's just the way the cloth wants to move that gives you the different sensing capabilities. And so here's just another detail of the cloth as it came off the loom and the files I used to kind of enact it. And here, finally, with my very broken phone, because I'm a klutz, is a diagram or a video of it in action. So when I press the regions, the voltage changes, and then I send that to a little web server. And then if you have your phone, you get a little window to that web server, and you can see the reactions over time. So the concept with this piece was really trying to think not just about how we make technologies, but what we do with them. And I've really been interested in this idea, I actually have it in a few slides up, I think I went backwards here, that how we might reimagine our technologies and our relationships to technologies through textiles. And so kind of coming back to what we're actually going to do with these woven circuits. So yes, we can weave circuits. We've been doing it for quite some time. But what do we actually do with the things we make? And how does that actually reconfigure the human technology relationship? So I was really inspired by the history of the spacesuit. And this is sort of encapsulating this idea of getting away from the human flesh, that it's literally a suit that makes our body able to inhabit harsh environments. And so I started thinking a little bit about, well, what would it mean to make suits for my own body to inhabit my environment? And that's where this nipple poncho came up. At the time I had had young children, I had just started professing, and I felt the need that many, many people needed to suck on me. And I felt the desire to satiate everyone while at the same time wanting to protect my own body. And so this was my first kind of exploration into this idea of how these kind of skins actually both protect you, but make your vulnerabilities visible. And that's when I started bringing in the circuitry into this concept. So the second garment is I call the exoskeleton for sedimentation. And this has really been guiding a lot of the research into these force sensing structures. And so the exoskeleton for sedimentation has these embedded force sensing structures, but it's not a hug meter, right? Lots of people look at this and go, oh, you can remember all the hugs you got. But it's not just the hugs, it's the way that your chair supports your back. It's the way that your body gets formed in relationship to other human and non-human bodies. And what would it be like if the cloth became a record or a map of almost the way we were eroded over time? What kind of forces would we see come out? And would that prompt a kind of reflection on these themes of interconnectedness? The piece that I'm actually showing in chat as part of this exhibition, a second piece, is called Where. And Where was trying to take this concept to maybe like a reductio ad absurdum, like take it to the extreme. And I really envisioned this idea of hand making the cloth almost from the fiber up. And so I started actually, and okay, I wore this head-mounted GoPro the whole time and made a video. And it's very odd, and I question why I do these things, but I realized that my house is messier than I would like, and my kids, I'm surrounded by craziness at nearly all times. That's what the videos have revealed. So in this part of the video, I'm actually felting the force sensing structures. And so you can see here that I did some wet felting with just stainless steel fibers, and they make a really good, they compress a lot on pressure, which gives you a really nice sensor reading. So I created those little bobbles to be my force sensors, and I embedded them in this entire garment that was meant to track not just the interactions that were happening on my upper body, but across my whole body. So I mocked up this garment here on the left with tape and muslin. And then I eventually wove in all the kind of circuitry components and details. And so, of course, this is just a lot of figuring out the circuitry by hand. I'm not an electrical engineer, so I apologize to those who might be looking at this and rolling their eyes. But again, I really want to just, it's pencils on a page. It's moving your hand in certain ways. It's not, this technology isn't magic. It's from the earth and it's made by hands. And when it is created, it's vulnerable. And that's actually something that I think is interesting about that, and not something to sort of develop away. So again, here's some of the drafts and schematics that I used to design the piece. And really tracing every one of those by hands, measuring all the pieces, making sure I could integrate them like you saw in the video. And ultimately what came out was this full-length garment that had all these regions in it. And I had an SD card, so like a memory chip, that could record all these interactions. And when you see it in the gallery, this is one very common interaction. My daughter sticking her hand down my shirt while we watch movies. What happens is that the cloth is displayed in the gallery, and you can actually see the forces that were encountered through color change. So each of these regions will actually change color in proportion to how much force they received over time. So again, it becomes like a map or a record of that interaction. And it was a way, I thought, to kind of keep the body in the cloth, right? That you're going to see a cloth installed, but I didn't want it to be a technical demo as much as I wanted it to be a record of an experience. And what happened to be a very intense experience of living in quarantine most of the year with my children. And even though we're isolated, still seeing all these interactions that are happening along our bodies. So that color change is actually happening through these pigments called thermochromic pigments. And thermochromic pigments, like hypercolor t-shirts, change color with heat. And so I use a little wire to generate heat, and that's what actually triggers the color change. And I don't know, I get a little excited about the technical things, but if you are working with thermochromics and you happen to find yourself with the ability to purchase a thermal camera, it's amazingly helpful because you can actually look through this thermal camera window and see all these areas of heat moving across the fabric. And I really loved that because as much as the color change kind of speaks the language of new technology, this more subtle idea of the heat that's being produced through the friction of bodies kind of coming back out of the cloth was one that I thought was really interesting and poetic. For the sake of time and being able to hear from Annapurna and what she has to say, I'm going to go ahead and end it there. But thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thanks, Laura, for that wonderful present. I love the very unexpected jumps. You know, we're going very microscopic with a weave, and then next thing is an entire garment. That is very fun, very technical, to something very playful. And I think those jumps are pretty incredible to sort of, you know, come from just a single mind like yours. So thank you for that.
Well, I'm mentally unstable, and so I'm embracing that.
Yeah, it sounds like you've got lots going on. Lots of people trying to, you know, as you said, suck on you. That's an interesting thing to say, actually.
I mean, literally, they were sucking on me in the
right,
little ones. But there is this kind of idea that that's what a primal desire we have, is to suck on each other.
Yeah. And then to also give. Yeah. Well, thanks, Laura. I'm going to turn the time over to Annapurna for your presentation. Annapurna, would you like me to share the video? Actually, I'll share that video first.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Using extraordinary That's the first step, and it did not just justify at the time it happened. But then we went on, and these are the people who do the dye engineering, and they continue their
Thank you. So what you saw just now was a clip from a conference about 2 years ago in 2018, actually, where almost 400 weavers, mostly from India, but also from Southeast Asia, met together, brought their looms so that they could talk to each other. They could talk weaving to each other. And what you just saw was a Laos weaver teaching the local Chirala weaver how to do the tapestry weaving. They didn't have language in common. They didn't have a word in common. But the knowledge, as you can see, the knowledge transmission was absolutely seamless. And that's what I wanted to start with. So I'll start sharing my screen, may I, for the presentation?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay. So it was at that conference that I first met Ellen, who is my project leader at Deutsches Museum. And she was doing this project called the Penelope Project, where she was trying to show how actually in ancient Greece, women were seen as a source of knowledge because of their weaving. And they were also weaving was the base on which mathematics actually took its eventual form. So, and this idea that women performed weaving as labor while the men actually did all the talking and the philosophizing is something that she was questioning. And one of the ways in which that she does it is through trying to explicate weaving knowledge. So trying to show what is weaving knowledge. And I think in a sense, that was interesting with the videos, Laura, that you are, when it goes fast and you only follow the body movements or the movements of the loom, you don't catch anything. You don't see anything of what is happening. It's only in that slow movement and that you can actually see the brain thinking, even though the brain isn't actually present and what you're looking at is the hand. So at that point of time, I was still, I was moving between Germany and India, trying to, so my own experience was working with handloom weavers directly. But here suddenly I met Ellen, who was a weaver who could speak and who could speak what was going on in her mind. So I thought, okay, this is an opportunity that I want to take to spend time with such a weaver and see how that can help me to explicate what weavers who may not speak in the same way, what they know. So that's how I got involved in the project. Before that, I was, before I did my PhD, for many, many years, I worked with an NGO that tried to support weaving livelihoods. So in India, we have almost, the number varies, but something like between 3 to 4 million handloom weaving families. And they all still live, the major source of income is handloom weaving. And when organizations like us who try to support livelihoods go into that milieu, we always go in with the idea that we have something to offer them, that they are actually vulnerable, and which they are, but that, in some way there is something that we as outsiders can offer them that will make their lives better. So when you go in with that kind of view, you are thinking about more about what you know, and therefore what you can use to fix the problem, rather than actually look at what's happening there. So there's a very a kind of a kind of a moral story that's taught to you in the beginning when you first go in, because we know very well that the power equations are very unequal. So the story goes that there was a bumblebee that was flying, and some engineers got hold of it and asked it, can we figure out, can we take some measurements and do some, kind of mathematical equations to figure out exactly how you fly? Because you shouldn't be able to fly. Your body is too big and your wings are too small. You shouldn't be able to fly. So the bumblebee says, well, I have children at home and I have things to do, and but they say, no, just. So it says, fine, okay. And then they do all the measurements. And the story goes that at the end of a long day, they come up to the bumblebee and say, we've looked this over and over again. It's just not possible. You cannot fly. And then the bumblebee tries and it can't. So this is the kind of interaction that we were warned against, that you go in thinking that. But however much we tried, when it was only working through the idea of looking at weaving as labor or as a livelihood or a mode of production or an industry, it becomes very difficult to have the kind of conversations with weavers about what they know. And it was only, for example, to give you an example of how that works, we used to give weavers in a particular village, orders to make products in certain colors, because there were customers in the city who would buy it. So they would, so the first time we went and we asked the dyer, the local dyer, to show us what colors he could make. And he showed us a deep green and said, and we liked it. And we said, okay, make it. And then I said, what is the name of this color? And he said, it's called Damayanti. And actually it was the designer who asked. So we were a group of people who were working. So, and then, so we came back and said, okay, send the thing back to them and say, make Damayanti, 20 meters. What we got back was not a green, but a brown. And then, so we asked him, but we asked you for Damayanti. And he said, yeah, this is Damayanti. So then we decided they don't know how to standardize colors. They don't seem to have a vocabulary to standardize colors. So from now on, let's treat them like idiots who can't standardize and just give them samples and say, make this, make this, make this. So, and that's what we did for 10 years. It was only when I went back to that place and started thinking about knowledge and what did we miss here? And that was when the designer told me that in her conversation with the weaver, what she found out was Damayanti was not the color, it was the depth of the color. Because for the dyer, what his capability was how deep he could make the color. The color itself didn't matter to him. So what he called Damayanti was a certain deep brown or a deep green or a deep blue. Now, when you don't realize the skill that the dyer is making claim to, and you impose your categories, then it is this kind of misunderstanding. But it's not just the misunderstanding that's a problem. What happens is that you impose your categories and your evaluations on them. And so I began to really see that these kinds of unequal experiments, this is the history of weaving knowledge in India, at least, or craft knowledge in India. It's just all these unequal encounters that have, brought weaving to a point where we think of it as something that is vulnerable and needs help from outsiders. But the question that people really ask, if you try and tell them that weaving is science, it's technologies, is it really, is it really technical? Where is the text? Where's the abstraction? And it's the same loom you've been using for the last, 1,000 years. Where's the progress? And what value does it have to the future when, why should you weave at all when there are mechanical looms producing much better, much faster? And how can you even hope to scale? You have these tiny, tiny clusters of people weaving together, and how are you going to clothe the world with this? And what was interesting is what came from the ancient Greek exploration of Ellen, where in India, we had these kinds of terms. So text and abstraction, no, there's nothing. It's all embodied. It's all tacit knowledge. As if, and therefore somehow ephemeral kind of knowledge, which is not stable like science. Well, there's no progress because it's mechanistic labor. If value to future, no, it's all about the heritage. We have to carry some of it forward in a notional way, but no, there's no future to this. And the scope and scale is seen as very, womanly, small craft. But from the Penelope project, what I saw was that they were talking about text and abstraction in terms of patterns and poetry. And the progress question was answered very much by looking at the loom as a digital technology and trying to make it visible as a digital technology through using other digital technologies. And the value to the future was its mode of existence, which actually created such a sustainable system around itself, which is even more true in India because it's still there. It must have been true in ancient Greece, we don't know, but it's definitely true in India today. And the scope and scale is that it's differentiated. There are different moving parts, but you can bring them together in very, very different ways to make different possibilities happen. It's a different way of looking at scope and scale. So the first part of it was actually the numbers. This idea that you have universal numbers, and somehow weavers do some kind of embodied ethno-mathematics that is not universal. So it's very difficult to query, to question this kind of understanding, because of course pure maths is pure maths, and numbers in the threads are not really numbers. But what was interesting, looking at it through Ellen's eyes, the weaver who could speak, the historian of mathematics and the weaver who could speak, much like Laura, what I began to see is that what she was saying about numbers was that, well, you can say you have 2 oranges, you can say you have 2 apples, you can say you have 2 people, you can say you have 2 threads. And maybe the 2 is the same in all of them. But the way in which those numbers operate in those materialities are each very different. For example, 2 people can make a baby. 2 threads can be, can go as warp and weft. 2 oranges can be peeled. And 2 apples can be cut. So what I'm trying to say is that the materiality of that number, when you look at the materiality of the number, you begin to see that the 2 is not at all universal. The 2 affords very, very different kinds of operations in very different kinds of material. So it was not so much about showing the abstraction of the number in the loom, but talking about the materiality of the number in our so-called pure mathematics, a number system that goes 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1. And any operation that does not go like that, the number system really can't handle. So, so looking through the eyes of a Greek weaver, then I thought, okay, what is the puzzle that we can solve for the Indian? this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about my colleagues' research. And this is a story that I've heard them tell about ancient Greece, which I really like. So I'm trying to tell you the story. It doesn't come from my own research. So if I struggle a bit, please excuse me. So the story goes that a young slave boy is asked by a very, very famous philosopher to double a square. So that's the picture. If you can see my cursor, you see, this is the square. And he's asked to double the square. What he does is he increases by half both sides. So he makes 1 into 1.5 here, 1 into 1.5 here, and finishes the square. Can you see that? But then the area of that square is 9. It's not double, it's not 8. And this is actually done by drawing it on the sand. So first he draws the square. The philosopher draws the square. The slave boy tries to double it by drawing the square. And he quickly can see that it's bigger than double. Then what the philosopher does is he draws a diagonal on the square. When he draws the diagonal on the square, the slave boy can quickly see that by drawing a square on the diagonal, he's actually doubled the square. So you have 2 triangles in this square. This square has 4 triangles. So he's effectively doubled it. Now, what is interesting about this is that while this line could be drawn, the diagonal could be drawn, if you try and actually write it in numbers, it becomes an irrational number. It is the square root of 2. And for the Greeks, if there was no perfect ratio between 2 numbers, like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, and if you had numbers like this, which were square root of 2, then they called them numbers that cannot be spoken, alogos. And what they considered was divine was the logos and the alogos together. They didn't think of the logos as being pure and the alogos. It was the very fact that the alogos was beyond words that proved the divine for them. Now, that's as far as the Greeks go. What does that do when it comes to materiality? Now you see that same rhombus pattern on all kinds of fabrics. But the minute it is material, as thread, it starts behaving differently. For example, when you have to draw a rhombus, you always have to have an odd number of threads. So when you count, when the weaver is counting with the hands, they're always making sure that they don't end up with an even number of threads. So use your fingers to count. And so what you begin to realize is that because you're not drawing it, but you're actually weaving it, the way the number itself behaves, the way it behaves itself changes. And this is what I mean about the number being the operations making that come from the material actually change the nature of the number. And this is going to be a recurring theme in this talk of this kind of reversal of logic, that what we think of as stable and what we think of as unstable being questioned. So what does it mean to manipulate numbers in making patterns? This again is a small example. Again, Laura will immediately understand what this is. So one of our colleagues, Dave Griffiths, made this little counter where you could decide which thread would go on top. So if it was black, then the thread would be on top. And if it was white, the thread would go underneath. And when you set it like that, it would then on the computer screen show you the pattern that it would make. So here you've got 3 threads on top, right? So can you see you've got 3 threads on top here? Now, let's look at what happens when you enlarge that. So this pattern is actually, when you repeat it, it becomes this pattern. Now, it's still okay if it's the same color. The minute you put another color, the pattern completely changes. Here you have a blue, white, blue, white, blue, white. Say you put a blue, white, red, blue, white, red, the pattern would look completely different. So this frustration that Laura was talking about knowing that everything is causal, you know that when you take a decision now, whether you turn the coin this way or that, whether you put the thread up or down, it's going to have an effect. But your mind, because there are so many effects possible, that many possibilities, you have to really learn which possibility you're trying to make happen. Because it's going to come in the future. When you've taken the decision, now is not when it's going to show up. So Ellen calls this actually brain pain, what you call frustration, necessity of frustration. So I think it's something that other weavers do feel. I remember also a story from my working days when we used to work in this little village that used to make a lot of checked fabric. And because the markets wanted, a different check every month, we'd keep sending off different patterns to them to make. And when we went back once to them to ask how things were going and whether the wage was okay and this and that, one old man stood up and said, "Your patterns are making my head pain. Stop." And of course, I didn't understand what he meant then. It took that actually that kind of material manipulation is reorganizing your brain. That is something that, when you think of it as being something like metaphors, it's not. It's doing something physical to your brain when you change the way you move your hands. And another of my colleague was somebody who did live coding. So they used code to make music. So they wrote here. Alex writes code and makes electronic music. Now he used that method to start so Ellen said, well, can we try and see if we can use that method to show what codes are happening in the loom? So then he wrote up a program where he tried to take his live code, the coding system that he calls Tidal, and try and get it to weave. And created this thing that could move this using solenoids. He tried to make them move up and down as he coded, to try and understand exactly how that code would interact with the fabric. I think what was most fascinating for me about this experiment, that it did not teach Alex much about weaving. It taught him much more about coding. Because what happens in this situation is that because he is not manually manipulating the threads, but he's manipulating the code, he started getting better and better at manipulating the code to make better fabric. So this was how they talked about progress, that what you are actually progressing is not the loom, it's not the technology, you're progressing your intelligence, you're progressing the way you think. You're thinking in algorithmic terms and you're being creative. And what this experiment did of the live coding and looking at the performance of the coder and how you produce certainty and how you create possibilities, all these things basically show you what's happening at the loom and what the weaver is doing at the loom. But it needed these digital technologies to be able to show that appropriation. So what is the relevance to the future? So the first thing is, a normal tendency for me at this point would be to talk about sustainability, would be about saying, there are these complex systems where, okay, I will talk about sustainability. I just give a small example. This is something that is my mentor Uzramma told me long ago, which kind of stuck in my head. There used to be this community called the Kunche Erukula community that used to make the brushes with which weavers would apply starch on their warps. Now the story was that they would hide their bits of gold in that brush because they were traveling from village to village and didn't want to carry it. But nobody would open the brush and steal that because they didn't want to lose the brush. And they didn't want to lose the trust of the brush maker because they didn't know how to make the brushes themselves. So the idea somewhere that the gold was less important than the relationship and the trust of the brush maker gives you a sense of the kind of identity. Now that very same thread rope that they used to make the brush was also referred to in a text called Manasollasa. It's a medieval text. And they said that they made ropes out of it to tie elephants. It was strong enough to tie elephants. And the wood was so strong that you could grind oil in it. And the story was that they would have ox that would go round and round the wood, making the oil. And that those oxen got their strength from eating the sorghum, the millet, which today is hybrid and only about this high, but those days used to be 8 feet tall and filled with sugary sap. So when they ate that, they had the strength to turn the oil mill. And the same sorghum was also used to make brushes, which would go onto the loom. This is the kind of complex ecology that was interwoven. So when you think of sustainability as a one-to-one point, it's these complex ecologies that we have to sustain. And so it's all these relationships that have to come back to life if that gold in that Kuncha Erukula's brush has to come back. So this is not, and then, if you can go and think, oh, I will make a design, or I will sell a fabric and everything will be sustainable. That's a little bit simplified. So that's it. So that's how, it's not just making the weavers don't just make fabric. It's a mode of existence that makes a sustainable social world. But what does that give us to our epistemology, to us as scholars? What does that give us? First thing is that when you understand that these oppositions of logos, alogos, spoken and unspoken, for example, abstract, material, rational, creative, explicit, tacit, that these oppositions really are not very productive for us. And this is something that weaving tells you, because it is digital, it is binary, but it is not oppositional. It's about balance. And when you understand that, you begin to see how these dualities can actually work very differently with each other. So in the project, what Ellen starts with is that she talks about this STS scholar Latour, who, talking about ancient Greece and the Pan-Athenian festival that used to happen, asks if that were to happen today, what kind of ambassadors, what kind of scientists, what kind of philosophers, what kind of people would be brought together in such a, such a parade. And what Ellen says, and then he says, what is it about science that is not able to grasp all those other modes of knowledge? So he's saying, in this festival, you had all those other kinds of ways of knowing in ancient Greece, but how is it that our modern science is not able to capture this? And Ellen says, that Latour makes the same mistake that science makes, which is that he forgets that this festival was actually about carrying the woven cloth, the peplos, and presenting it to Athena. It was about making that cloth and giving it to Athena. And in leaving that bit out of his parade, he's already lost the ability to grasp any other way of knowing than what he thinks of as science. So the question is, what does weaving bring back? And I think that in our quest for explicit knowledge, in constantly trying to explicate out of a material register into an abstraction, and not recognizing that that register is valid only as long as it can be re-embedded into another material medium, that these abstractions exist only in between iterations, in between different kinds of mediums. When we forget that, we create increasingly knowledge that is smaller and smaller and narrower, and leaving out all the conditions of possibility that material actually affords us. And here I want to go back to that original video that I showed you about those two weavers who speak to each other without words. You don't need words when you have the same material practice. That's very clear. There is no misunderstanding. There's absolute understanding between the two weavers. When do you need words? When do you need metaphors? When do you need explication? When you have to talk to someone who doesn't have your own material practice. And then what do? You try and find those words that are in common in his material practice, so that when you are talking to each other, there is something that he understands, that he recognizes from what he knows. Therefore, that abstraction actually only exists between what you know and what the other knows. And what I'm trying to say here is, therefore, this explication will always continuously change. In fact, this explicit knowledge is the thing that is constantly changing. The material practice itself is very stable. So therefore, the idea that we have somehow that explicit is stable and that the tacit is somehow ephemeral and difficult to grasp is completely nullified when we bring the material back into our science. So I'm going to stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annapurna, for that lovely presentation. I think it's very clear to me that both of you are incredible storytellers. It's very compelling listening to you both speak very generously, in fact, I think. And I want to bring our conversation to this idea of reconciliation, I think. I want to talk about that a little bit in both of your practices. I think more directly and most obviously in your works in the Unstable Design Lab and then in the Penelope project, there's this idea of bringing together weavers with engineers, for example. But it's also, to me, it's about reconciling this narrative that Annapurna, you were just talking about, this unproductive sort of oppositions that we consider, we put onto ourselves. You know, when we think about weaving, I wrote down a few that's off the top of my head. You know, we think about the warp and weft, the automation, the manual, emancipation and the oppressed sometimes even, speech and labor, individual and the collective. So I think there's, in addition to your practice of bringing together people of different disciplines, it's also about reconciling these differences. So I think my question for you both right now is actually, how, in your ways, how are you letting these people know of each other's constraints or bringing together these people? Could be these concepts that you're trying to bring together. And I think more specifically, I want to talk about the idea of weaving being a deeply material practice. And I want to see if both of you, how you're trying to engage people materially with their bodies to weaving and how that might actually work into your own agendas when you think about binaries or oppositions.
Laura.
Okay.
That's the order, so we stick with the order.
I feel like we're playing tennis and we had that moment where the ball's in the air and we're looking at each other. Thank you so much for the question, Bruce. And I think it's interesting, and you know, and thinking about the word reconcile, it seems to want to like make something messy cleaner, or to make two into one. And so I have a little bit of resistance in terms of the words and things of like, well, I don't want to reconcile anything. I just want to put more things in the soup, right? Like I want,
it's that kind of a brain pain that Anna.
Yeah. Or just, I think maybe some of it is that we're just not our little silos or our little boxes that we sit in and our disciplines. are a little too reconciled, right? And that we could open them up, and that in that disruption, there might be new resonances. And so there's some theorists that use this by talking about the difference of metaphors of reflection and metaphors of refraction, right? To reflect is to sort of be on the same page, to see your image somewhere else and to be able to recognize it. And maybe this came up in the use of metaphor to sort of relate practices to each other. But I think you could also look at it the other way, which is this metaphor of refraction or diffraction, where it's that space in between where all the waves are kind of colliding and crashing, and that something new might come out of those spaces. And so I think they're always both existing, and that we just sort of pick up on one to the other. Practically, I think trying not to do the us versus them or the binary thinking has helped me go into engineering contexts, which I'm really comfortable in, but to see how their practices are already material, right? Like an engineer is they have a craft, they have a material, they're speaking with it, they're learning from it. They're like, it's very much the same in a lot of ways. I think the difference comes in how we report it, right? Where one person reports the material and the messiness as the foreground, where the engineer often hides that under the kind of clean results. So I like to think that all these potentials are always already existing, and it's just a matter of maybe putting us in the same room. And it was really wonderful, and we hosted a residency, and the engineering partner we had actually learned to weave. And it was amazing how much that knowledge that she had of weaving, again, it would enable them to speak on the same terms, much more than what we thought, which was going to be, oh, well, our weaver needs to know something about programming in order for this to work, which it turns out they didn't, that all of the knowledge they needed was in the weaving. So I guess my take would be to have more, I don't know, sit around and weave events as a way to kind of just be around one another and find the spaces that we resonate or not. I'm going to just keep rambling. So I'm going to lob the ball back to you, Annapurna.
If I can respond to Laura first, if I may, and then I see very much your practice as your reconciliation of the two. I mean, it's in your body. The reconciliation is actually happening inside you. And that's very different to me, because I know a little bit how to weave, but I'm actually a dyer if I have a material practice. But I'm more a jack of all trades than an expert of anything, which is why I'm very good in between registers. So I very clearly see that you're able to, the way you're reconciling is you actually inhabit those practices. So, and there must be resistance. So, as you move, so I very much like what you said about engineers and crafts. For me, it's always been a question that we ask ourselves in our little groups of activists, scholars, historians working with craft. What is craft? Because everybody has a material practice. You can think of writing as a material practice. So, who doesn't have a material practice? So I think one of the things that has become very clear to us is it's about time. It's about taking time. If you are willing to take time and do something, I mean, that sounds a little bit romantic, or, like you should cycle everywhere and not go by car. And, that's not what I'm trying to say, but that attention, because time allows you to pay attention. And if you're able to pay attention and learn, then I think it becomes a craft. So in that sense, craft is not in itself anything more beautiful than engineering, or it's just today, it's the balance that we need to draw back from the kind of speed and of production and living that we have been racing into. So it's, you can use this as a way to just put on the brakes and say, hey, stop. So I think that's because engineering definitely has this idea of plan, execution, speed, So I think it's not so much about the material practice itself.
I very much think about this, thinking about all the sort of cheesy metaphors on a most superficial level. I think about, the idea of warping a loom, the idea of struggling through the threads and applying tension onto it, and having the body become the loom in its most, most rudimentary sense. You're putting tension onto threads. That's a loom. And I think that these are very much that experiences that are so unique, but that is so hard to come by anymore. So I'm very happy to hear about your respective practices of putting speed engineers into the rooms with weavers. That's very special to me. I want to also bring the discussion also to something that's more specific to some of your projects. I want to talk about fabric and also fabric in space, fabric in relation to the body. We actually have a question from the floor about Laura's work on touch and how that gets interpreted into life experiences. But I think I also want to maybe add on to that question a little bit and open it up to both of you, actually, is to maybe you could share some thoughts on the experience of cloth in space and how cloth can actually become records of the body or records of experiences. In a sense, in the artistic practice of Laura, it's quite visual. We can sense it, we could see it. It becomes these, graphs that Laura, you just shared, those thermochromic graphs we just saw. But I also want to maybe open it up to something that's more conceptual of how you think of textile as a material that exists in space with the body. Could be clothing or warp, winding a warp onto the loom, dyeing fabric, dipping your hands into water. I want to see what that experience is like for you. As we're talking about tacit knowledge on this digital platform, I also want to, talk about that. Can I throw the ball to Laura first?
Yeah, I'm ready. Sorry, I'm nervous, and so I'm gonna get silly. Yeah, I think there is this idea, and I was actually really inspired. We had a weaver who came to our lab and did a workshop with us. Her name's Tally Weinberg, and she does a lot of weavings that are inspired by climate change and specifically climate data. And somebody came into the lab from the university newspaper and said, oh, well, will you share your data set? And I loved that she said, absolutely not. Like, this is not about getting the data back out. The data's in there, it's material, and I've recorded it in this way, but this isn't a tape you can put in a VCR and then play the data back out. And I think about that a lot, just in terms of these memory garments and things like that. And I've been thinking about it maybe more along the lines of an early project. I called it force photography. Like, how do you take different inputs and materials and just have some effect come out? But I don't know if that information can ever speak to any single experience with any amount of truth, right? You kind of put the information as data in the garment, and then it kind of seeps out in its ways. And in the provenance of the story that data was in there. But it's like when you make a loaf of bread, you can't then take the flour out. You got to do something else with it. Maybe you chop it up and eat it. So yeah, I like the idea of it just invoking a history and inviting different interpretations, and that your memory of those pressures will change over time, and no interpretation you have is any more right than another. It's sort of just, maybe the fabric becomes a prompt to recall something, or it just sort of makes it visible in the same way that the wear on your leather wallet makes visible where it cracks and how you hold it and things like that. And that's, I guess, how I kind of think of it in relationship to the body. I love the way that that textiles train me. I want to do a whole series of videos just of the things your hands have learned to do. But other than that, I think I like that they go on the body, but I don't necessarily see them as having, like, cloth and the body don't have to be together. I think I'm rambling now, so I'm actually going to turn it to Annapurna.
You might have noticed, no, that's good. Yeah, you might have noticed that I turned off my video because I went to get a memory textile myself. This is, I don't know if you can see, this is hand spun local cotton from the hills. That's hand spun and hand woven. Can you see the?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it has fine gold threads running through it.
Mm-hmm.
Now this is this is a sari basically, right? So this fabric has so much history. It has so much meaning because it's from an area that where I belong to. So it was a sari that my mother-in-law wore, my grandmother wore, that both grandmothers on both sides wore. And I have saris from their cupboards kept carefully with me with all kinds of stains on them because they really use those saris. But these looms still carry on. And then they make this beautiful fabric that I can buy. And it's the memory that it carries is of all the techniques. So of growing that local cotton, of carding it using fish jaw teeth, of spinning it on those big wheels. And then the women spin and then the men weave the patterns. And this pattern, which is, because the fabric itself the cotton itself is slightly brown color, they call it red cotton. You don't need to put much color on the body. So all you do is you put color on the borders. So you have a little bit of color on this border and then a little bit of color on this side. And that's the sari. And this design has stayed steady, constant, saleable for I don't know how many hundreds of years. So that's another memory textile.
I love this. I know this idea of memory is also in another part of Laura's practice, which is kind of about speculation, or we're talking about these memoirs, memory, and thinking about textile in a very heirloom kind of way. But I know that Laura, in your sort of design process, if I can say that, you're thinking about metaphors and how that could actually lead into acts of speculation. I'm wondering how you see your work that's very much about things close to your body, that's about right now, that's very much about recording what has happened, and then how what your speculative practice brings to that sort of a that kind of work you do. And do you see it as an extension, or is it something else?
Yeah, thank you. Your questions are so good that I have to like chew on them for a little bit to really to really kind of work through them. Yeah, I mean, I think there's this interesting maybe connection that I see between speculation in the future and speculation in the past and speculation in the present, right? Like it's what we think is possible in the future is so deeply rooted in what's happened and what we know of the past. And, if we're living every present moment, the second, we separate from a moment that it becomes past, it changes in our memory, right? And that years and years go by and you remember something maybe more clearly than you ever did in that immediate moment. And so I guess in some ways I'm trying to speculate on how we'll remember. So it's all kind of mixed up in some ways, but at the same time trying to just make things that speak to the felt experience in the given moment, right? Like there's a bit of an urge to want things to be different. Like I want technologies to be different. I want to relate to them differently. And so I want to imagine what that looks like. And so I make things, and then when I make them, the whole purpose of the thing I'm making is to think about the past or to sort of remember how I was present in a given moment. Because I think just in terms of all kinds of readings and things, I am working quite hard to just remember to be present in the current moment. And we get wrapped up in the speed of engineering and the publishing and the putting your artwork out there and sharing it on Instagram. And we can forget every moment that's happening as it's happening. So I want, what would it be to have Instagram that recalled you back to your felt experience in a moment, where it wasn't about showing yourself to others, it's sort of revealing yourself to yourself. And that's, I think, where I've kind of seen cloth as being useful is one, because I enjoy making it. I like the time that I make it. I like that it's an equipment for making time. If I'm sitting at the loom, and I love that in old, not even that old, but in weaving books, there's anecdotes for what to do when your phone rings or what to do when your child interrupts you. It's sort of based on this idea that you're going to be in a space for a while and you're going to be interrupted. And so in some ways, I think the actual making of the cloth helps me become more present or just stationary in my environment and easy to be interrupted and see what else is going on. And then the things that come out of it, I want them to also sort of fold into that experience, right? That help me remember what it was like to have children when they're going to go away. And I'm going to miss this, even though it's tough. And to try to hold on to those memories, not just the happy moments, but how it was all formed together in some ways. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Laura. We are, I could speak to you guys for so long. It's very comforting. Somehow it's about, I don't know if it's because we're all, myself included, somehow involved with weaving. I just feel like in our
community.
It kind of registers. But I want to, before we really come to an end, bring this webinar to an end, I want to address some questions that are left in the comments section. There's one question that is about how embodied textile experiences give way to reconceptualize relationships between humans and technologies. It points to Weeb's research on innovation and what are the intended and unintended implications. I'll also, I keep doing this, but I'll also add onto this question. I think I would also like to know what the weaver is like for you both. Who is this person? Who is the weaver at the face of technology? And what is the role of the weaver amongst all of this? Amongst, again, the speed of engineering, but also, impositions of categories, as Annapurna said. What does the weaver do? And how does that sort of mess around with the relationships that we have with technology now?
I'm going to let you get started on this one, Annapurna.
Okay. I guess it's difficult for me to think of the weaver. They're my community. They're the people I work with. They're some of them are my friends. And it's a strange it's a strange interaction because a lot of them are men, and traditionally women of my background, social background, would not be friends with it would not be common to have friends who were weavers in some faraway village. And so I guess for me, they have been, I have one particular friend, weaver, who is Odalu. I don't think he would call me his friend because that vocabulary doesn't exist. But he would say we are kin. So I remember that one story that Uzrama told me, the person I started working with in 1990 told me that when she first met him, he took her for a walk he took her and her another engineer friend for a walk on the bank of the river Godavari. And after they walked about 500 meters together, she happened to look back at the footprints on the ground. And she says that this Odalu's footprints were hardly there. They were so light. He had such a light way of walking on the earth that it was indeed almost a physical presentation of that. And somehow that kind of stuck in my mind. For me, that is a weaver, someone who walks lightly and leaves a very light impression of himself. So I guess that's it.
That's very lovely.
I love that answer. And I don't know if I have much to add beyond that, other than my knee jerk was to say, well, everyone's a weaver but I don't think that kind of answer is very satisfying. And maybe just to bring it back to equality like you did in some ways, Annapurna. And I think a weaver is humbled and seeks being humbled in some ways. I don't think it's possible to do the physical work of weaving without negotiating with your materials and your machinery. And so I like to think of a weaver as anyone who sort of approaches their practice from a place of humility. And in that, just when you experience that and you know how hard it is, if I see a piece now that has an amazing selvage, it's like, wow, that I appreciate it in this way that I never could have if I didn't try to do it myself. And so I think by exposing yourself to the difficulties, you end up cultivating a lot of appreciation for the work that's been happening that we may not see. So all that'll be my metaphor for a weaver.
Thanks very much, Laura and Annapurna. What I'm getting out of this conversation is actually the idea that I don't know how to put it into words, and I think maybe that's the point, but it's about like metaphors really have like a material effect on us, I think. We think of it as this figurative thing, or that, as Annapurna, you put it in such a lovely way. We think of it as unstable, or that it's something that's so open to interpretation, but that there's a certain inertness to it that's quite incredible. And I find that I feel that a lot when I speak with people who practice, who are practitioners of a material practice. So thank you very much, Laura and Annapurna, for the incredible conversation today. And I also want to thank everyone for joining us and for being part of this panel as audience for the past 90 minutes. You have all been great audiences. Thank you so much for sharing your questions with us. I guess maybe before I go to some, slides advertising the next panels, I would like to see if maybe Laura and Annapurna, you have some words you want to say, or I could also move on to those slides too. Let me know.
I just want to say thank you so much, Bruce. You've been really wonderful, and I have really appreciated how you've organized this and moderated it. So thank you for being part of the conversation.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, and thank you. I'd like to say thank you too. And I got to meet Laura, which is fantastic, which I would never have. So we'll keep in touch. Thanks.